When we opposed the Hate Crime Act, Scottish Conservatives warned the legislation would overburden our already overstretched police. Now that's exactly what has happened. 40 officers a day have been brought in on overtime to deal with 9,000 reports of hate crimes in the first 2 weeks. Callum Steele, the General Secretary of the International Council of Police Representative Associations, has said this: "Police officers have been left embarrassed by the hate crime farce, with some left so angry that they've told me they have never been more ashamed of being in the police service than they are at the moment." He added that officers have been pulled from other parts of the service to deal with these complaints. So why does Humza Yousaf think he's right and the police are wrong?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, can I remind Douglas Ross, of course, that when it comes to hate crime, almost a quarter of the hate crime reports, victims are police officers, presiding officer. And not only that, from the statistics that we have to hand, many of them suffer the most outrageous abuse, some of that directed because of prejudice in relation to somebody's sexual orientation, sometimes in relation to their race. And what we've witnessed over the last few weeks is, I think, the most debasing, worrying, concerning debasing of our political discourse by the Conservative Party in relation to the Hate Crime Act. Imagine, just imagine, presiding officer, that the Conservatives had been successful in repealing the Hate Crime Act. If the Hate Crime Act didn't exist, with the stroke of a pen, it would have removed protection against stirring up of hatred for those who suffer racist abuse, for those who suffer anti-Semitism, for those who suffer Islamophobia, for those who suffer homophobia, transphobia, those who suffer abuse because of their disability. What a reckless and frankly unforgivable approach for a party that seems more interested in gaining shoddy tabloid headlines than actually protecting people from hatred, presiding officer.
Douglas Ross.
Shoddy tabloid headlines for quoting from police officers.
Let's hear Mr Ross.
To police officers in this chamber, and that's the response they get from their First Minister. It is a disgrace, First Minister, that you are unwilling to accept the failures of your bill and listen to the voice of police officers up and down the country. But if you won't listen to police officers, listen to others, like us, who have said this bill was too vague, it was poorly defined and it wouldn't work. Now some of Scotland's top legal experts have said the same. Alistair Bonington, Professor of Law at Glasgow University, said the law was extremely dangerous. And he said this: "It could see entirely respectable and reasonable citizens prosecuted for expressing viewpoints which the law would allow in almost every other country in the world." And Lord Hope, formerly a Supreme Court Justice and Scotland's most senior judge, said the Act had misfired and described it as unworkable. Like the Scottish Conservatives, Lord Hope wants to see the Hate Crime Act repealed. So why does Humza Yousaf think he's right and legal experts are wrong?
First Minister.
In all of that, of course, the one group of people that Douglas Ross is refusing to listen to is the victims of hate crime.
Absolutely.
And that has been consistent for the last few weeks when Douglas Ross has come to this chamber around the Hate Crime Act. Let's look at some of the details. Out of the 8,984 hate crime complaints that were made to Police Scotland in the first couple of weeks of April, the vast majority, at least 95%, have been deemed not to be crimes. So this idea that somehow there would be mass criminalisation for people for simply expressing their opinion or being insulting or being offensive, that of course did not materialise. And why did it not materialise, presiding officer? Because if you look at the detail of the Act, it makes it abundantly clear that for the new stirring up offences, that of course that behaviour has to be threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. So we have a piece of legislation that does, of course, what any civilised society would want a piece of legislation of this nature to do: protect people from hatred. And of course it has the appropriate balance of protecting people in terms of their freedom of speech and their freedom of expression. If only, presiding officer, the Conservatives spent more time opposing hatred as opposed to opposing the Hate Crime Act, then wouldn't they be in a much better place, presiding officer?
Douglas Ross.
Humza Yousaf's bad SNP law because of the impact it is having. Victims of hate crimes are not getting the support from the police because they are being inundated with thousands of complaints. We are hearing this from the police. We're hearing this from legal experts. And we said at the very beginning this Act would put free speech at risk. And we will all have heard reports of a 74-year-old pensioner who was taken by the police to a station over a dispute with her neighbour. This grandmother was not charged, she had not committed an offence, but she has been punished by the process, exactly as we warned would happen just a few weeks ago. And public opinion is already against Humza Yousaf's law. A recent poll found that 2/3 of Scots thought the Hate Crime Act should be repealed. So why does Humza Yousaf think that he's right and the public are wrong?
And still,
First
once
Minister.
again, of course, presiding officer, in that question, Douglas Ross does not mention the victims of hate crime. Time and time again, he forgets to mention
Let's hear
the
the First
very
Minister.
people who suffer hatred. You know, in the figures for 2021-22, there was almost 7,000 hate crimes recorded in Police Scotland. That's 7,000, or almost 7,000 people who've been the victims of racist abuse, victims of anti-Semitism, victims of Islamophobia, of transphobia, people who've been victims of hatred because of their sexual orientation or their disability. And these people deserve protection. And what we've seen in the last few weeks is deliberate disinformation from the Conservatives and many other bad faith actors who've refused to look at what the law actually does. And the law is abundantly clear. For the new starting up offences, that behaviour has to be threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. In terms of police officers, let's go back to what Police Scotland have actually said. And let me commend and thank Police Scotland for the incredible job that they have done, despite the fact there have been many bad faith actors in relation to the Hate Crime Act. They have, this has been, in Police Scotland's own words, a minimal impact on frontline policing in the first couple of weeks. Let me thank police officers day in and day out, not only for the work that they do in relation to tackling hate crime, but for the fact that almost a quarter of the hate crime reports are against police officers themselves, presiding officer.
Douglas Ross.
Yousaf is describing opponents of his bill as bad faith actors. First Minister, that is 2/3 of Scots who at the moment want to see your legislation repealed. And Humza Yousaf is sitting here saying everything is fine with his legislation, just like he did with the ferries that he couldn't get to sail, the trains he couldn't get to run on time, the NHS waiting lists that grew under his stewardship of
Let's
the
hear
health
Mr
service.
Ross.
We warned him all of these problems with the Hate Crime Act would happen. We warned the police would be overwhelmed. The law was poorly written. It would put free speech at risk. He dismissed every single valid criticism. Humza Yousaf said he knew best. Now the police, legal experts and the public are telling him he has got this badly wrong. The only person in Scotland who seems to think this Act is working well is Humza Yousaf. How on earth can the First Minister say that the Hate Crime Act has been a success?
First Minister.
Well, again, Douglas Ross, of course, once again misrepresents the facts. The Parliament did not back the Conservatives. In fact, the Parliament backed the Hate Crime Act, with, of course, the exception of the Conservative Party, when he brought forward a motion to repeal that bill, that Act. Of course, it was Parliament, as a majority, that rejected the Conservative motion. Presiding Officer, when I talk about bad faith actors, I'm talking about the Conservative Party. I'm talking about, for example, the Observer, who reported that neo-Nazis, those in the far right, were organising and orchestrating complaints to go into Police Scotland. They are, by any stretch of the imagination, bad faith actor. There are far too many bad faith actors who have been spreading disinformation and misinformation. And despite their misinformation, despite what they had been warning, which was proven to be untrue, despite what I suspect even maybe some of their wishes were, the police dealt with those thousands of complaints and dealt with them well. And of course, only a minority of those complaints have ended up being recorded as hate crimes. And, Presiding Officer, let me say this, that every single one of us stands in this chamber, time and time again, saying that we have a zero-tolerance approach to hatred. Well, I have to say, that has been sorely tested by some of the comments that have been made by the Conservative Party in recent weeks. If you have a zero-tolerance approach to hatred, Presiding Officer, you should be getting behind this Act and supporting the victims of hatred.